Next, I'm going to introduce Denise Ohio, and she's going to talk about her story of making a documentary, Verona, about the Everett Massacre. A very uplifting topic.
Thank you, Joanne. I had a question. I was working on my presentation for you all this evening, and I realized I think you're more interested in the making of the documentary and how I used local history and local history archives to put together a full-length documentary, rather than let me tell you about the Everett Massacre. Am I right about that?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and show you part of the presentation I did, because it includes the trailer for the documentary, which you can find on pretty much any streaming service, such as Amazon. Okay, and let me go ahead and open that up.
So are you sharing yet?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Happening now.
All righty. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah, so before I get going here, I'd like to say there are some disturbing images in the trailer. And so I'm just giving you a heads up, if black and white pictures of dead people unnerve you, you may want to look away. Okay, and here we go. Come on.
Oh, it's ironic that people could found a community like Everett based on middle-class values and churches and strong union leadership and strong socialist party could end up in such desperate circumstances in 1916.
November 5th, 1916, 250 members of the Industrial Workers of the World aboard the steamship Verona were met at the Everett City Dock by Snohomish County Sheriff Don McCrae and 140 deputies. When the shooting stopped, 1 man on the dock and 4 on the ship were dead, 2 men were dying, and dozens were wounded. What brought them to this point?
So did that play for you all? Okay. Okay. Well, I think some of you probably recognize some of the folks in the teaser. There was, of course, Margaret. Well, Margaret wasn't in it. Yes, Margaret was in it. Norm Clark, the late Norm Clark, was in it. He was up in LaConner. Later in the documentary, of course, I interviewed Dave Dilgard for 3.5 hours. And one of the big challenges of making any documentary, especially about a local historical event, is that you have both huge amount of material and also very little material. And what I mean by that, and I'm pretty sure some of you have come across this, where somebody brings you a box of stuff and they're like, oh yeah, it's full to the brim with this and this and this. And you open it up and you realize it's receipts and old envelopes and maybe 1 or 2 pictures, but they don't seem to fit any specific time period, or they're definitely outside your time period. And so in making Verona, there were a series of steps that I had to do in order to gather enough material from the larger archives, and then specifically to go find unique, particularly images. And that's where I spent a ton of time, not just at, the Everett Public Library in the Northwest Room, but at MOHI, the University of Washington. But I literally went to people's homes and they would open up a box, or in one case, a trunk full of stuff their parents or grandparents had left for them. I remember specifically there's one image of a woman named Latelzia Phi, who I met her son. And he told me all the stuff about Latelzia, and he said, I got a picture around here somewhere. And out came the trunk, and he opened it up. And I'm not kidding when I say there were pounds of stuff in this trunk. And I went through all of it. And there was one picture of her, a family portrait photo of her, but there was Telzi. And during the telling of the story of the Everett Massacre, Telzi Phi is one of the people in Everett who challenged the citizen deputies, the sheriff, and the police regarding free speech. She got up on the soapbox and began reciting the Declaration of Independence. When a police officer basically came toward her to arrest her, she jumped down and ran away. She had 2 kids and a boarding house, and as she said, I couldn't be arrested. I love Telzi Phi. I've never met her, but I finally was able to put that small act of courage with a face. And Verona has entire portions of the movie is made with material just like that. We found some old film footage. I'm sure you guys have seen the film footage, maybe at the Everett Public Library website, of the Everett 1916 Labor Day Parade. It was shot by a guy named, I think his name was Joe Valentine, who owned a movie theater in Everett, and he bought a film camera so he could capture footage of local events and screen these events at his theater to get people to come in and buy tickets. And he shot this footage of this Labor Day parade from the time period 2 months before the shootout at the city dock took place. This happened to just be this footage that somebody had in a box, and they brought it to David and Margaret. And Margaret turned to me and said, do you know anything about transferring film to video? And I said, why, yes, I do. That happens to be my job. So we were able to transfer that footage to a format they could put on the web and could put into things like my documentary. These small archives aren't small when you need the material. And I'm sure, again, I go back to, I'm sure that all of you have been through a situation where you're looking through newspaper articles and you have no idea what you're going to find, but the simple fact that the collection is there means you can spend 5, 6, 7 days, 8, 9, 10 hours, as you know, you feel like your eyes are bleeding, and then you find that one tiny newspaper article that's, you know, 1.5 inches long. That just happened to me because while I finished this documentary, I'm not done with this story. And it was 2 years ago, I happened to find this tiny little 2-paragraph article about a guy named Herbert Gerlat, G-E-R-L-A-T. One of the men killed during the Everett Massacre was named Hugo Gerlot, G-E-R-L-O-T, and the IWW reported his name as Gerlot. Everybody referred to him as Gerlot. They misspelled his name. His name was Hugo Gerlat, and Herbert had gone to the local authorities because he had heard his oldest brother had been killed, and he wanted to return his body from here back to Milwaukee, where the family was. 2 paragraphs. Took 6 days looking at page after page after page of one Milwaukee newspaper. I didn't have to go through all of them, just the one. I got lucky this time. And so right now, I'm in a position with the project I'm working on where I'm going to have to see if I can try and track down Hugo Gerlat's family, because I'd like to know what happened to them when they found out their oldest son, oldest brother, now probably, you know, great uncle, great uncle, what happened to the family when he died. This leads me to another kind of serendipitous moment. I happened to be at the Northwest Room when somebody asked a question about the Mosquito Fleet, the little steamships that plied Puget Sound. Again, I'm sure you guys know all about the Mosquito Fleet. And she said something about her father and her brothers all working on ships. They were all mariners. And I was like, oh, really? Well, do you know anything about this ship, the Verona? And she said, oh, yeah, my uncle was a crew member. And I was like, really? And I said, from how long to how long? And she said, I think it was April 1915 to April 1917. Turns out, not only was she a maritime historian, her uncle had indeed been on the crew of the Verona. Now, for me, this is one of those things that the fact that I can put a name and then she had pictures and a face to somebody who was actually on board is wonderful, because it fills out the story for me and for people who are watching my documentary, people who are going to be reading this next project I'm doing. But she also told the story that she heard from him when she was a little girl, which was he actually had been in his bunk when the shooting started. 2 bullets came through the wall of the cabin and he had to hit the deck and lay on the floor so as not to get struck by bullets. And again, it gives me just a little bit more insight into what that experience was to be on that ship. So another thing that happened was, see, lots of stuff happened. I happened to make contact with the Beard family. Jefferson Beard had actually been the sheriff of Snohomish County and then under Sheriff Donald McCrae when the shootout took place, and he was killed. He actually was wounded, and it was a nasty, nasty type of injury. He was the second man hit on the dock. He fell to the dock and then was trying to drag himself to cover. And there are several eyewitness testimonies to this happening. It sounds awful. The Beard family had been reticent to speak to people because their experience had not been very good. Somebody would want to interview, or they thought there was going to be some kind of conflict or something. I got lucky, and I managed to persuade them to just talk with me off camera, because I just wanted to know. And I wanted them to have a chance to meet me. And it's like, look, I'm not here to point fingers. I just would like to know what happened. I can't understand why something happened if I don't know what actually happened. And the record so far seems to be incomplete and sometimes just wrong. So I talked with them. I talked with Jefferson Beard's grandson. And again, reticent, and yet he did answer some key questions for me. There had been a rumor that Jefferson Beard had been shot in the back, and that the family had insisted that he had been shot in the back and it was all Donald McCrae's fault. And I asked, and his grandson just shook his head and said, no. He just went like this, no. I'm still in touch with several members of the Beard family, and they shared family pictures of Jeff Beard. Now, I'm not saying Jefferson Beard was a warm and fuzzy and kindly man, because it doesn't sound like he was. But he was still a human being, and he still had people who loved him. And I can certainly judge his actions, but to be fair to his family and to history, I have to listen to what they have to say and weigh it against other evidence. And sometimes that evidence is found, like I said, in a trunk or a box, or one of those sets of notebooks or somebody's diaries that they left. And I mean, that's what I have to do. That's part of my job. It's part of the goal that I've set for myself in working with this material. Another thing that happened is I managed to find the family of Charlie Curtis. Charlie Curtis was also a citizen deputy who was killed on the dock that day. Again, no one had ever talked to his surviving children. His wife, in fact, lived to be 101 years old into the 1980s. And no one had ever interviewed her. They were in Seattle. No one went looking. But I talked to his daughters, his 2 surviving daughters. And what's interesting is that they said first, Charlie Curtis hadn't been a citizen deputy very long. He'd only been deputized the day before, so on November 4th. He also they weren't sure if he had been carrying a firearm. Don McCrae said he was not and said so publicly. But it turns out that in the court transcripts, it turns out he most certainly was carrying a firearm. He didn't fire that weapon. He was firing someone else's weapon. There's a whole weird story with that, which I found when I found the transcripts for the trial of Tom Tracy in the spring of 1917. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, because that's another one of those sort of, I hadn't anticipated finding that material. But Celia and Charlotte, Charlotte particularly was old enough. She was 10 years old when her father died, and she really didn't want to discuss. And it wasn't until later in the interview, when they were both on camera, that I could see she was both still angry and still hurt. And I can't bring her father back or any of that other kind of stuff, but I don't think anybody outside of her family had asked her and had listened. And that's another thing that I could do, especially with local history materials. Often you find people, they're here, they're our neighbors. And you just, sometimes the best thing you can do for them is to just listen and give them a fair hearing. And they give you information, material, stories that you can use to further understand the event that you're trying to explore. There was another thing about Charlie Curtis that just, it kills me. His family did not know that Sunday afternoon. It was a beautiful Sunday afternoon, November 5th, 1916, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. They didn't know he basically, Celia and Charlotte said this neighbor told their mother, you should send the girls next door. And the kid.
Can you repeat that, because you cut out.
The neighbor said you should send the kids next door. And so their mother sent the 3 girls to the next door neighbor, and they never saw their father again. And they didn't understand what had happened, and no one would tell them until they were adults. The other thing about the court transcripts that I wanted to mention was, I don't know. I think it was in the 1930s. Amongst that was the court transcript of this trial of Tom Tracy. And everyone just said, this is gone. It would have been a great historical artifact, but it's gone. Well, it's not gone. It's sitting in the bowels of an archive in Michigan. And a friend of mine who is a documentary filmmaker, you know how sometimes when you ask your friends for favors and you know it's bigger than a favor? Well, I asked this friend of mine for a favor that was bigger than a favor, and I asked him to please digitize the 10,000 plus pages of the court transcript and the investigator notes from the defense team. And I have all of that material. And interestingly, I didn't find that until after the documentary was done. I had decided I was going to continue telling this story. So I'm still constantly gathering material, because, you know, the more you know, the less you know. just when I think I've got a handle on the elements, something else comes along. The last bit I want to share is, this is really interesting. Just an aside, people often ask me questions about cameras, lighting systems, how do you edit a movie, you know, the technical aspects of filmmaking, but they rarely ask me the research side in kind of in a forum like this. So I really appreciate that I can do this, because I'm sure, again, any of you who've done any, you know, probably most of you, you do some writing, or you do a slideshow, or you do a display or anything like that, to have that moment where you feel like, first, that you've been able to tell the story that you wanted to tell. That's always wonderful. But even more, to talk with people when you know that they know what it's like to find that one thing. You find that one thing, and it's not the answer to everything, but it's so great. It's so perfect. And it's usually some small thing, something like, in my case, like an IWW card with somebody's signature on the back. That happened. I didn't find an IWW card, but I found a Lake Carriers Association card with Hugo Gerlit's signature on the back, which his name is spelled Gerlat, so that I had confirmation that was how he spelled his name. And it was his signature. It's something he actually put his own hand to. And it made him just a little more real for me. And I know some of you know exactly what I'm talking about, just that one moment where everything is perfect. You know, then it all goes to crap a minute later, but in that moment, and I'll take that moment. The last story I want to share, and then I'd be happy to answer questions, is I interviewed the nephew of a guy named Abe Rabinowitz. Abe Rabinowitz had been with his family, had migrated to the United States from Russia. They were a Orthodox Jewish family. They lived on New York's Lower East Side. They were extremely poor. But Abe, who was the oldest of 4 children, sorry, I'm collecting myself. This is a true American story, and I mean that with all the possible bitterness I can bring to my voice. Abe worked up from, we're talking poverty in the city. He worked his way through CCNY and NYU. He got a college degree in basically what we would call business and journalism. And he and his brother Maurice set out hopping freight trains to go across country to earn money and to see the country. And Abe was very, very interested in journalism and pretty clearly was thinking about a career in either journalism or politics, maybe even business, who knows. He and his brother parted ways. Maurice got on a ship on the Great Lakes, and Abe ended up out here. He was a little guy. He was not even 5 feet tall, and he was working various jobs. And then here, this young man happened to get on the ship, the Verona, on this beautiful fall day. A young man who had worked himself into a position of education and opportunity, which ended when he got shot in the head. His 12-year-old sister had to arrange for his body to be returned to New York from here. I met his nephew, Dan, who told me this story and told me the story of how his father, Maurice, and Abe's mom, she never laughed again. Maurice said she never laughed again. The loss of her son was devastating to her. A woman who was devout in her faith couldn't understand how a boy who had worked so hard and had been so promising had been murdered, and no one was held responsible. Sorry, it's a story that even after all this time, I find it to be devastating. And it's not just that Abe Rabinowitz met his death on the Verona, or Hugo Gerlat, or Gus Johnson, or Felix Baran, or John Looney, or the men who fell overboard and whose bodies washed up and were weighted and dumped off Mukilteo Point. It wasn't the loss of Charlie Curtis and the loss of his children and his wife to his presence through their lives, or the loss of Jefferson Beard. It was also the loss of all of those people who died in the woods, in the mills, who died riding freight trains, who died in factories, and we don't know who they are, and nobody cared. Except now, there are small organizations and larger organizations who can actually say it matters to me. When ordinary people living ordinary lives do extraordinary things, they stand up for you, they stand up for me, they stand up for things like the Constitution. And it's not just the Library of Congress with its wonderful collections, but collections like yours or at the Everett Public Library or in Mohi that bring these things. They give us faces, They give us voices, they give us signatures, they give us signs. They give us all of this stuff that we turn into stories that are meaningful to ourselves, to our communities, to strangers, to people around the world. Verona has played film festivals in the United States. It's also screened in other countries. For some reason, my movies do really well in Western Europe. I don't know why. And the simple fact that we can communicate these kinds of stories because of local history collections, archives, it's amazing. We all have problems now. We're always living in historical times, and we're all cursed with living in an interesting time. But there's something about looking at historical events as a way to kind of rehearse, a way to think ahead about what would I do in this situation. So when I face these challenges right now, here and now, at least I've had a little bit of look ahead on how to behave with dignity, with grace, to stand up for the right thing. And now I'm preaching, and I'm going to stop, and I'd be happy to take your questions.
Do you have any questions?
No, I'm just pleased that she found some sources other than Wobblies.
So there's a question. Well, I've got a question, just a general one. How do you know, because I would imagine as you kind of start digging in and you're doing the research, how do you know, like, okay, that's enough for that documentary? Because it seems like you would continue to go down rabbit holes. I would always be like, oh, it's never enough. I'm not quite there. There's all I'm doing. How do you make that decision?
That is a great question. It is an ongoing question. Most of the documentary filmmakers I know are filmmakers first. They're not archivists. They're not trained as archivists or any kind of researcher. They either hire researchers, or when they do their own research, it's usually about a topic that they think they can make a movie about. You usually have a set amount of time because you have a set amount of money. In my case, this was a personal project, and it took me 20 years to make this movie. And it took 20 years because part of it is I never felt that I didn't have it. I didn't have it all. I knew the story that I could make, but I didn't think that was the story that wanted to be made. This wasn't necessarily the story that needed to be told. And as I said, I finished that documentary, but my next project is, in fact, the annotated Everett Massacre. I don't know if you guys know this book, The Everett Massacre by Walker C. Smith. This is like the official IWW version of events. It has since become the received wisdom about this event. Here you go. And as you'll also see on my sticky notes, the annotated Everett Massacres, I'm going to take his text, and I'm going to take all of this research that I have, and I'm going to go ahead and write essays, because I'm also was first and foremost a writer. Photography, still images, 3D, forensic recreations, and go ahead and annotate his text, because this received the received wisdom based on his writing has some issues. And I'm like, first and foremost, have some respect for the people who were involved in this event, and, you know, be truthful, be as truthful as you can be. And so that's my next project, and that's a 10-year project. And I'm okay with that. So in answer to your question, how do you know when you have enough and you should stop? My answer would be, you are totally asking the wrong person.
Sounds like you just keep going and continue on and go down rabbit holes and let it see where it takes you.
There is nothing wrong with an obsession. It's just such a human story, and there's just so many people involved. And ultimately, for me, I want to know the why. And I don't know if you can know the real secrets of the human heart, but that's not going to stop me, because I'm foolish. My other friends who are documentary filmmakers, though, a lot of they stop because they have to. You have a delivery date. You make a piece of television, essentially, and it has to be done, finished, and ready to air by a certain date, or you run out of money, and you know that the chances of finding more money are pretty slim. So they give themselves deadlines, and that's pretty much that.
I have a question just about a fact. Did I understand you to say that there were bodies dropped off the Mukilteo Spit?
Is that what it's called? I just knew it was off of Mukilteo was how I had seen it. Yeah.
But the point is that they disposed of some bodies near Mukilteo
Yes.
or in the water.
In the water, yeah. This has been an ongoing rumor, but the circumstantial, the combination, the just the sheer number of these kind of rumors and eyewitness accounts and stuff like that suggest this actually happened. I can tell you, I feel almost certain that there were at least 2 and as many as 10.
Holy smokes.
I can give you, I have in my notes the names of 6 men who went missing, one of whom was actually a guy who wasn't involved with the IWW. I'll get back to him in a minute. His name was Albert, and his last name escapes me right now. But yeah, so the rumor was the bodies washed up when the tide came back in, and the coroner, a guy named Malsby, Albert Malsby, picked up the bodies, wrapped them in burlap, weighted them, and then with a helper went off in a small boat off Mukilteo and dropped the weighted bodies in the water. And these guys were not. Their reasoning was so much bad stuff had happened. Identifying these people wouldn't have helped anyone. To which I say, well, it might have helped their families.
I was just going to say, except for their
but,
families, but
his point was that after the shootout, there was the situation in Everett was so tense that any little thing could have caused this to immediately turn into a shooting war. That they thought this entire city was divided, and it wasn't just divided like people snubbing people. It was people getting into fistfights, people wanting to kill each other over this. It was, as Norm Clark said, it was very uncomfortable. And then he just nodded his head. And then, of course, in 6 months, we were involved in World War I, and that seemed to cause a lot of this tension to dissipate. But the guy from Whidbey Island, who I need to track him down. He's on my list to find out if he ever returned. He had been in Seattle. He had told his family he was coming back. He was going to go to Everett on the steamship on the Verona on its regular run, and then he would catch a boat back over to Whidbey Island. Albert Pontius, his name was Albert Pontius. Well, Albert never showed up, and his brother-in-law rode over to Everett to find out what happened to his brother-in-law. From what I can tell, as of today, they never found him. So either Albert died that day, or Albert faked his own death and was the luckiest guy in that boat. Because, so I'd like to see if I can find his family. We'll see. That's, he's on my list. I think I have like 300 names of people to track down because obsession.
I have a question regarding tracking things down. The obvious place to have looked for the trial transcripts would have been Snohomish County, but obviously they weren't there. You found them in Michigan. Can you tell us the story? 1, how the records got to Michigan, and 2, how you were able to find out, track it down there?
Yes, I can. It's not as exciting as it sounds. There are people who, when they get a box of stuff from a great uncle who's died, they never look in the box. And then someday, their children open the box. And that's exactly what happened. A guy from, I want to say, as I recall, he was from Montana, had a box that had belonged to his mother's great uncle, or I mean, it was kind of one of these second cousin, twice removed, 3 times over kind of relationships. And the guy had no family, he had no children. And so she ended up with his stuff and she never did anything with it. She died. This guy was going through all of this stuff and he found all these legal documents. He immediately contacted an auction house and they put the documents up for auction. And specifically because there were some documents in this collection where you'd say, well, that's not really valuable, but I could see why somebody would want them. There were some documents that had been signed by important people involved in union stuff, and some politicians. So they put the entire collection up for auction. If I had known the collection was up for auction, I would have found the money to buy it. I didn't find out until after the auction was over, and it was purely by chance. I stumbled over it. And turns out I contacted the auction house and said, so who bought this? Well, we can't really tell you that. And he said, please, 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 I'm a poverty-stricken filmmaker and I love this kind of stuff. If I cry and say prayers for you, will you tell me? And they said, well, you didn't hear it from me. And it was in this archive in a university in Washington or in Michigan. And like I said, I happened to know this filmmaker friend of mine who lived in the same town, and he had to live in the same town where this collection was because the woman he's married to is an archivist at this university. And so I said, Peter, would you go down to the basement and see if the stuff is really there? And he did. And he said, okay, they haven't even processed this material yet, and they won't. They have so much stuff, and this just isn't that important. I was puzzled because then why'd they buy it? And they bought it for the signatures of some of the politicians and union officials. So I said, so Peter, you're my friend. I'm going to ask you a favor that's more than a favor. And I'm going to put some money on the table too. Please go digitize all this stuff. And it worked out great for me because he did an amazing job. It also worked out great for him because he finished digitizing all this material, and 2 days later, that archivist he was married to and still is married to had their first kid. So he had enough money to pay the medical bills. So that's how and it was just, I stumbled over it. I stumbled over the arrest records. You know, when you get booked, I'm just talking, this is all theoretical. I wouldn't know anything about getting arrested, wink. But when you were booked back then, they literally would write your information in a book. That's what they had, a special arrest book. And these things are like big. And they would, after a certain period of time, when they started doing mugshots, they would take your picture and they would glue or tape your picture into the arrest records. Well, the Snohomish County arrest book, around this time period, all these books were missing. There were 3 of them that are missing. They're supposed to be held at the National Archives, not the one in Sand Point, but the one that's, I think, north of here, maybe east. But it was far enough away that I was like, if I go, I'm going to have to spend the night, and I can't do that right now. But again, I happened to stumble over somebody put these books up for auction, and I happened to stumble over it because I'm not going to say money is the root of all evil, because I like money just like everybody else, but clearly somebody thought they were going to make money off of this, and they did. And these 3 arrest books, which should be sitting in an archives because they actually have pretty important historical value, are sitting in a private collection in Canada. And I contacted the auction house, and they said, well, I don't know if we can help you, but the archivists who control this private collection, you know, the tar sands where people were extracting oil, this guy made a fortune doing that, and he decided he was going to start a museum called the Museum of Modern Conflict, or the Archive of Modern Conflict. And so he began going around buying arrest books and mugshot collections and crime scene photos and war photos and stuff like that. So he has this massive, huge private collection of all of these materials. And he has 2 archivists who work with him to process this stuff. I emailed one of them, and I I just happened to email her at exactly the right time. She had the books sitting on her desk. So she went through and took a bunch of pictures for me of these pages with her phone. But these pages had particularly interesting information about, for example, one of the guys named James Whiteford, who was arrested and charged with the murder of Jefferson Beard. There was a page pasted into the arrest book which listed all of the other things he had been charged with. And this guy, he was a drunk and a thief, and he'd been in jails and in prisons across the country. Another guy named James Bates had been to prison for armed robbery and ended up serving a life sentence in Walla Walla because he stabbed a woman. Another local guy named Patty Seifert, and these guys were all involved. They were all charged with these murder charges. Patty Seifert was a local Don McCrae. He lived in Marysville, right near where McCrae lived. And I finally saw this arrest book, and there was a sheet with his mention of his record as well. And it's like, oh God, he went to prison when he was 19 or something like that because he stabbed a guy and tried to kill him. The guy didn't die. So, but then he was in prison for armed robbery, and then he was in prison for assault, and but again, stuff, and I'm talking about, all these guys are all kind of crime. They're out there doing crime. But more, it's like, this is their lives. And for some of them, being a thief was the way they had to survive. And almost all of them had previous charges, particularly for vagrancy. There was another guy who was named Dan McCall, who had been charged with vagrancy, and he had also been charged with carrying a concealed weapon in Montana, and was held for a very short period of time, which makes me think he may have been carrying like a pocket knife, and they charged him because they arrested him literally as he got off the freight train. And he didn't leave, and because normally these guys would hop off a freight train, and if they were caught, they were told, you need to move on. If you move on, we won't charge you. If you stay, we'll give you 30 days. If you are snotty about it, we'll charge you with something serious. And that may very well have happened to Dan, but all of these guys had charges like that.
Denise, when you're working on something like this that has so many threads and tails to it, do you do a visual board where you put your photographs and your some little story and then try to connect them together with the timeline?
That's a great question. I don't. I have for other projects. With this one though, I was driven much more. I spent a lot of time looking at pictures, just looking at them. I don't know why I did it, and maybe it was sort of my version of scrying or something. I'm just trying to read what these faces are telling me. But most of this story was driven by writing. So I began writing what I was seeing and writing a lot of the other research that I did. I actually have sitting right down on the floor to the right, I have one of those big, massive plastic cases that you use to hold file folders. That normally, like when you clear out your filing cabinet, you put them in these plastic cases, and the plastic cases go into the closet for your grandchildren to have to deal with, and then give them away to a local historical society. And all of the pages in there are pages that I pulled from local newspapers that I have copies of, and they're all cross-referenced and stuff like that. And I've read every single one of them, because somewhere in here, I knew the story was somewhere in here in the vocabulary, in the way that people were describing the people. Because it's very easy to go, oh, well, Don McCrae was mean to the Wobblies because he didn't like that they were poor, which was probably true. but there was something else about it. And it wasn't just that he dehumanized them. Don McCrae had been a international secretary of a labor union. Don McCrae was a proud labor union man and was elected sheriff twice with the help of labor. The Labor Journal called him the best sheriff Snohomish County ever had. So for me, I read these articles about this proud union man, this man who had been a labor leader, and then later in the county. And I have to ask myself, what occurred? Did he change, or was he always like this? Was he always the same man? And so in the telling of the story, that was the question. And I knew I wasn't going to find that question by doing what's called a storyboard with the pictures. I knew I could only do that by thinking really hard about people and what people do and why they do things, and then writing and rewriting and writing and rewriting, and then going back through the material to see what kind of images, footage, I did a bunch of 3D modeling. We actually have 3D animation to show some of the events that happened, and how to take those things to actually add another layer to the writing. So it's not just all blah, 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 but with the visuals, with the music, and then with the narration to create something whole and complete. So it started with the writing. I don't know if I answered your question.
I have a couple of questions. One is, have you used Ancestry.com or another Ancestry.com? Was that useful?
Well, I'd been working on this project for so long, those sites weren't really available. I did go to Family Search because I knew that the LDS Church, spent part of my childhood in Salt Lake City. I knew the LDS Church did a lot with genealogical research. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, they always have stuff. I did use some of that material back then, but boy, not only was it limited, it was often just wrong. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the times, with somebody, all you have is a name and you're just looking for maybe a date. And then if you combine a name and a date, maybe you can get another name and track it down. And so way back when, those resources weren't really available. When they did become available, I found them not terribly useful, but I will say over the past 3 years, and the movie came out in December of 2017. And I took a break. And then it was probably the next year I began research, going through my lists of names, and I have been using those resources, and it's been very useful, really useful.
Second quick question. Have you ever been tempted to shift to a docudrama or, heaven forbid, inspired by true events film?
Oh, I have to leave now. If you're going to insult me like that. I'm actually, I in addition to making movies, I work with both fiction and nonfiction. I'm actually a novelist, and I've had 3 novels published and a textbook on how to make movies. And the second part of the project, I have this, here I'm going to push the AEM, the Annotated Everett Massacre. This is actually part of a combined nonfiction fiction project. And so all of the research and stuff, and all in nonfiction, particularly historical nonfiction, I have rules that I follow that I don't break. And in fiction, though, I don't have to have rules. So the flip side of the AEM is I have the fiction side of the project, which is a combination of connected and interwoven novellas. The working title of that project is 1,000 Faces. And we'll see. I don't know if I'm going to keep that title, but it's handy for now because I have to accept that I'm looking at approximately, I have yet another case full of approximately 60 different main characters, which will probably equal out to be about 15 different novellas. And again, it's a 10-year project. And the whole point of that goes back to that whole thing about wanting to know why something happened. And I don't know if I can find the why in nonfiction. Whereas in fiction, I might be able to go at it sideways. And I'm willing to do things in fiction that I would never do in nonfiction. So based on true events, no, I wouldn't do that. I originally learned the story of the Everett Massacre. I had finished an independent feature and sold it, and I was asked to sit in on a meeting with a bunch of people who wanted to turn this story about the Everett Massacre and about the shootout at the City Dock into a fiction feature. And it was one of the weirdest meetings I've ever been to, but one of the big pluses that's where I met Dave Dilgard, and we hit it off immediately. And I was there to kind of answer questions about how do you actually get a movie made, and what does it mean to be a producer of a movie? And the answer to that is money. And so I went into the Northwest room to talk to David some more, and then I realized very soon, it was 2 days later, I went to go talk to him, and within about 10 minutes, I knew that what I wanted to do wasn't a fiction version of the story, but was the nonfiction version of the story, what actually happened, because there seemed to be real confusion. And how can you know why something happened if you don't know what happened? So that's that 20 years ago, I started pursuing the answering what happened.
Well, thank you, Denise. We need to move on to the rest of our meeting, but I'll be in touch with you by email. And thank you so much. And
thank you.
I mean, everybody go check it out on Amazon.
Yes, I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. And you guys, seriously, I don't belong to the Monroe Historical Society, though I'm a fan. And I go to the Northwest Room all the time. And historical societies are only small. It's kind of like actors. You know, if you think you're small, then it's small. What you do is actually really important for the members of your community, and particularly for people like me. So let's talk about how important I am. Because in your collections are stuff that I can make a story that's about being human in this time and place, or this place back then, or whatever that story is going to be. And I can find that story in the material that you manage. And that John Price, whatever his name is, the simple fact that you are trying to track him down, that matters, because people matter. Ordinary people matter.
I'm using Family Search to try to find if he had any known relatives, and I have not found any.
Good luck.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank
Denise.
you.
Thank you very much.